On a freezing New York morning, a homeless veteran quietly asks Keanu Reeves for just $1. What happens next? Keanu stops everything, looks deeper, and makes a choice that changes a life forever. Would you recognize the moment when compassion could rewrite someone's story? Watch to discover how it all unfolds. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. It was another bitter morning in New York City. The sky hung low with thick gray clouds, and the air stung like needles against exposed skin. People bustled by, bundled in coats and scarves, their heads down, their pace hurried. It was the kind of day when no one stopped for anyone. James Walker stood outside a small coffee shop near Central Park, shivering despite the frayed army jacket wrapped tightly around his frame. His hands, cracked and raw from the cold, clutched the thin edges of his sleeves. His breath came out in soft puffs of mist, vanishing almost as quickly as it appeared. He hadn't eaten a proper meal in 2 days. The coffee shop's warm air drifted toward him every time the door swung open, teasing him with the faintest scent of fresh bread and roasted beans. His stomach growled quietly, but his pride had always kept him from begging. He was a former staff sergeant, a man who'd spent years in service to his country, standing tall and proud. How had it come to this? The memories struck harder than the cold. His wife Sarah, with her soft laugh and kind eyes. His son Michael, whose teenage energy had once lit up their small home. They were both gone now. Cancer took Sarah, a car accident stole Michael, and life, as James had known it, had slipped through his fingers like sand. He had survived war zones and nightmares, but nothing had prepared him for the hollow ache of loneliness or the sting of being forgotten. That morning, as he stood watching the world pass by, something caught his eye. A sleek black SUV pulled up to the curb across the street. A man stepped out, casual but unmistakable. Dressed in a simple black jacket and jeans, with dark sunglasses hiding his eyes, Keanu Reeves moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had nothing to prove. His security detail was subtle but present. A large man in a gray coat kept a respectful distance, scanning the sidewalk. Keanu held a paper cup of coffee, steam rising in lazy spirals. He smiled briefly at a passerby who nodded in recognition but didn't stop. James watched, unmoving. He knew who Keanu Reeves was. Who didn't? The actor who played heroes on screen, but whose real-life kindness had become almost legendary. James wrestled with himself. He'd never begged before. Never. But the hunger gnawed at him, and the cold made his legs feel weak. He took a shaky breath. Just $1. That was all he needed. Enough for a small cup of coffee, or maybe a sandwich. He straightened his shoulders, forcing his back to stand tall the way he had in uniform, and stepped carefully across the sidewalk toward the man. His throat felt tight as he spoke, voice rough from disuse and cold. "Sir, could you spare $1?" The security guard noticed immediately. His posture stiffened and he took a step forward, positioning himself between Keanu and James. His hand hovered at his waist, an instinctual move to protect his client. But Keanu's reaction was different. Without hesitation, Keanu raised his hand, signaling his guard to stand down. He turned to face James fully, his expression unreadable at first behind the dark lenses. Then, with a small nod, he took off his sunglasses, revealing eyes that were calm, warm, and completely focused. "What's your name?" Keanu asked. James froze. He had expected indifference, maybe pity, but not this. Not a simple question spoken with genuine interest. He cleared his throat again, feeling the rough scrape of it. "James," he said softly. "James Walker." Keanu nodded. "It's nice to meet you, James." The security guard, who had relaxed slightly but still watched closely, shifted back a step. There was a long pause. Keanu didn't reach for his wallet. He didn't pull out cash or spare change. Instead, He looked James over with careful eyes. And then Keanu noticed it. Pinned to the threadbare lapel of James's worn army jacket was a small, faded badge, an insignia of his rank and service, a reminder of a life lived in honor and sacrifice. Keanu's gaze lingered there. His jaw tightened slightly, almost imperceptibly, but James saw it. He'd seen that look before. Recognition. Respect. Keanu took a slow breath. "What branch?" he asked. "Army," James answered. "Staff sergeant." Keanu's head dipped slightly in acknowledgement. "My father was in the military," he said quietly. "I grew up hearing stories about courage, sacrifice." James felt something loosen in his chest, not because of the words, but because Keanu meant them. The actor glanced at his security guard. "Thomas," he said, "hold my calls." Thomas, the bodyguard, gave a short nod and stepped back, giving them space. Keanu turned his attention back to James. "Why the dollar?" he asked softly. James hesitated. He'd practiced the words in his head, but they still felt heavy. "I'm not asking for charity," he said. "I just needed to feel like I still matter, like someone would notice." Keanu's eyes darkened with something deeper, understanding, maybe even regret. And in that moment, something shifted. A quiet energy hummed between them. The world continued to rush by, oblivious, but here, on a cold street corner, two men stood in stillness. One asking for help, and the other deciding what to do. And Keanu Reeves was about to do something that would change James Walker's life forever. Keanu kept his gaze steady on James, as if he were searching for something deeper beneath the man's worn-out appearance. The moment stretched longer than James expected. He'd asked for $1, not for attention, certainly not for kindness. But that's exactly what Keanu was offering, without a word yet spoken. "Have you had breakfast?" Keanu asked. James blinked. The question caught him off guard. He glanced down at his empty hands, the cold still burning his fingertips. His voice was raspy as he muttered, "No, sir, not today." He didn't bother adding that yesterday hadn't offered much either. He wasn't one to dramatize his own hardship. Keanu gave a simple nod. "Come on," he said, motioning for James to follow him. James hesitated. He looked toward the looming bodyguard Thomas, half expecting to be redirected away. But instead, Thomas only gave him a polite, brief nod, his hand casually opening the cafe door ahead of them. "Go on," Keanu said again, softer this time. James's feet moved before his mind could catch up. He hadn't been invited inside anywhere in months. He shuffled behind them, wiping his hands on his jacket, trying not to look as nervous as he felt. Inside the cafe, the warmth hit him like a wave. The aroma of fresh coffee and warm pastries nearly made him lightheaded. It smelled like life, like something normal people did every morning. The host glanced up from the podium, recognition flashing across his face at Keanu, but he said nothing. Keanu gestured toward a booth near the window, away from the crowd. No fuss, no entourage, just them. They sat across from each other. James kept his hands on his knees, as if afraid to leave a mark on the table. Keanu shrugged out of his jacket and rested his elbows casually in front of him. A waitress approached, wide-eyed but professional. "Good morning," she greeted. "Can I get you something to drink?" Keanu smiled. "Coffee, black." Then he glanced at James. "And for you?" James cleared his throat. The same, if that's okay." "It's more than okay," Keanu replied. Within minutes, steaming mugs were placed in front of them. Keanu nodded toward the menu tucked behind the napkin dispenser. "You hungry?" James hesitated again. Yeah, he admitted, the weight of it breaking loose. "But I don't have..." Keanu shook his head gently. "Order whatever you want." James opened the menu with trembling fingers. The words blurred at first, but he managed to focus. Pancakes. Eggs. Bacon. His stomach cramped just thinking about them. "The pancakes," he said finally. "And maybe some eggs." Keanu smiled. Good choice. He turned to the waitress. And add toast, some fruit, and more eggs. The waitress jotted it down quickly, her hand shaking just slightly before she retreated to the kitchen. For a few moments there was silence between them. Keanu took a sip of his coffee. Then he leaned forward. "Tell me about yourself, James." James swallowed hard. No one had asked him that in years. He glanced down at the table, watching his own fingers trace the rim of the coffee cup. But the silence wasn't heavy, it was patient. "I was in the Army," James started slowly. "Staff sergeant, 20 years, 2 tours overseas." Keanu nodded. "That's a life of service." James gave a half smile, one that didn't quite reach his tired eyes. "It was everything to me. My wife, Sarah, she was a nurse, and my boy, Michael. He was the light in our life." Keanu's gaze softened. James went on, halting but steady. "Sarah passed, cancer. Then Michael was in an accident. After that, I didn't have much reason to stay anywhere. I worked security jobs for a while, but my health... I got sick, couldn't keep up." He shrugged, as if it were nothing. Keanu listened, not once interrupting. He didn't offer pity, just quiet attention. "Now," James finished, "I'm out here." The waitress returned with plates piled high. James stared at them as though they might disappear if he blinked. The pancakes were golden, the eggs fluffy, the fruit fresh. He picked up his fork with shaking hands and glanced at Keanu. "Eat," Keanu said simply. James dug in, slow at first, but soon his hunger took over. Between bites, he said, I never wanted to ask anyone for help." Keanu nodded. "Sometimes it takes more strength to ask." As James ate, Thomas appeared quietly, placing a bottle of water and a neatly folded blanket on the seat beside him. "For later," Thomas said kindly. James murmured thanks, feeling the edges of his world soften for the first time in years. Keanu pulled out his phone, dialing quickly but quietly. He spoke in low tones, making arrangements. James wasn't sure what was being said, but he heard the words "room available" and "immediate need." It didn't sound like a casual favor. It sounded like action. A few minutes later, Keanu slid a plastic hotel keycard across the table. "It's not far from here," he said. "You'll have a warm bed, a shower, room service if you want it." James stared at the keycard as if it were made of gold. I can't take this," he said, shaking his head. "This is too much." Keanu tilted his head, his expression calm but firm. "James, you asked for $1, but what you needed was dignity. You deserve more than $1. You deserve a chance to stand on your own again." James's throat tightened. He clenched the keycard between his fingers, his knuckles pale. "I don't know how to thank you." Keanu smiled faintly. "You don't have to." There was a long pause. James's eyes welled up, and he looked away quickly, wiping his face with the edge of his sleeve. "I was invisible," he said after a moment. "Now..." Keanu nodded. "Not anymore." They finished their meal in silence. When James stood to leave, Thomas appeared again, ready to drive him to the hotel. James hesitated before walking out of the cafe. He turned back to Keanu. "What happens next?" James asked. Keanu gave him a long look. "Rest," he said. "Then we'll figure it out." James gave a slow nod, his fingers closing tightly around the keycard. The door swung open, and for the first time in years, he stepped into something that felt like hope. Keanu Reeves stood by the window of his hotel suite, his phone pressed to his ear as he gazed out over the New York skyline. His expression was calm but intense. On the other end of the line, a voice confirmed the arrangements. "Room is secured, Mr. Reeves. Long-term housing at the Veteran Transitional Center is ready. James Walker can move in tomorrow." "Thank you," Keanu replied softly. He ended the call and sighed. Then he dialed again, this time scrolling through contacts until he found a familiar name. "Santos," Keanu greeted when the call connected. "I need a favor. A comprehensive medical exam for a friend of mine. No red tape, just the best care. Absolutely, the doctor answered without hesitation. When? Today, Keanu said. I'll bring him myself. He turned from the window to find James sitting stiffly on the edge of the couch. He still wore the new clothes Keanu had given him earlier, but hadn't fully relaxed into them. They hung loose on his wiry frame, but they were clean, warm, and his. You ready for a drive? Keanu asked with a slight grin. James looked up, startled. For what? A checkup, Keanu replied. A proper one. We need to know what we're working with. James hesitated. His fingers picked at the hem of his sleeve. You don't have to do all this. I know, Keanu said, but I want to. That silenced James. He rose slowly and followed Keanu out the door. Thomas was already waiting downstairs with the car. He opened the back door and James slid in hesitantly, as if expecting someone to change their mind at any second. But they didn't. The ride to the clinic was quiet, except for the occasional glance from Keanu, offering silent reassurance. When they arrived, the staff greeted them warmly but without fanfare. It was clear Keanu had called ahead, emphasizing discretion. No press, no crowds, just care. Dr. Collins met them at the entrance. He was a middle-aged man with kind eyes and a firm handshake. James, he greeted, we'll take good care of you. James nodded but said little. He glanced once at Keanu, who nodded back. The examination was thorough. Blood work, x-rays, heart checks. James went through each step with quiet endurance, his military discipline kicking in. Afterward, Dr. Collins invited both men into his office. The good news, Dr. Collins began, is that most of what James is dealing with is manageable. Malnutrition, untreated hypertension, and some respiratory issues from prolonged exposure to the elements. James sat rigid in his chair. He clenched his fists tightly. With proper medication, good nutrition, and rest, the doctor continued, you can make a significant recovery. James exhaled slowly, his shoulders sagging with a mixture of relief and disbelief. We'll handle the prescriptions and follow-ups, Dr. Collins assured him. And Keanu tells me you'll have housing soon. Keanu gave James a look. Tomorrow. James stared at him, blinking. Where? The Veteran Transitional Center, Keanu said. You'll have a private room, meals, and staff to help with anything you need. James shook his head, stunned. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, Keanu replied gently. But there's one more thing. Later that afternoon, they drove across the Brooklyn Bridge. Thomas took a left turn onto a quiet street lined with old brick buildings. At the far end stood a newly restored structure with a wide lawn and a garden in bloom despite the cold. The car pulled up to the curb, and Keanu motioned for James to follow him out. Come on, he said. James stepped out cautiously. His boots crunched on the gravel. He looked around, confused. What is this place? Keanu led him through the front gates. A sign read, Brooklyn Community Arts Center. Children's laughter echoed from around the side of the building. The scent of fresh paint and clay lingered in the air. This is mine, Keanu explained. Or part of it. I fund it. We offer classes for kids, adults, veterans, art, music, sculpture, anything creative. Jamu's brow furrowed. Why are we here? Keanu turned to him. Because we need a groundskeeper. Someone to tend the garden, keep the place safe, help with the kids sometimes. James stared at him, struggling to understand. It's not charity, Keanu added. It's respect. James swallowed hard. You don't even know me. I know enough, Keanu said. I know you served your country. I know you've carried burdens alone for too long, and I know you need a place to belong. James's hands trembled as he glanced around the grounds. There was a wooden shed in one corner, garden tools neatly arranged inside. A young boy ran past them, chasing a paper airplane, laughing as his mother trailed behind. It's quiet here, James murmured. Keanu smiled faintly. You'll like it. James exhaled slowly. What about pay? Keanu chuckled. A fair wage, health insurance, and no one's going to ask for more than you can give. James's lips twitched into something close to a smile. You thought of everything. Keanu shrugged. I try. They shook hands there in the late afternoon light. James's grip was firm but tentative, as if he still couldn't believe this was real. But Keanu held his hand a moment longer, grounding him. This is the turning point, Keanu said softly. You ready? James took a deep breath and nodded. I'm ready. That night, James sat in his new hotel room, packing the few belongings he had. He laid the new uniform, simple, sturdy work clothes, across the bed. The badge for the Community Arts Center was pinned neatly to the chest pocket. He looked at the photograph of Sarah and Michael one more time and smiled. We made it, he whispered. Outside, the city lights twinkled, but James's gaze was fixed inward, on the road ahead. For the first time in years, he didn't feel lost. He felt found. The morning started quietly. James Walker woke in his room at the Veteran Transitional Center, greeted by sunlight streaming through a clean window. For years, his world had been a blur of cold concrete and restless nights. Now, his first thought wasn't survival, it was purpose. As James pulled on his new work uniform, his mind replayed the events of the past week. Keanu Reeves, of all people, had extended him a hand when he least expected it. But it wasn't just Keanu's gesture that left James speechless. It was the dignity that had come with it. He adjusted the Community Arts Center badge pinned to his chest. It felt solid, like an anchor in waters that had tossed him for far too long. But outside the walls of the center and the sanctuary he'd found, the world was taking notice. It started when a passerby, someone walking their dog past the Brooklyn clinic, snapped a photo. The image wasn't flashy. It showed Keanu Reeves exiting the clinic alongside James, his hand steady on the older man's back as they spoke quietly. The caption under the photo, hastily typed and shared on social media, read, Keanu Reeves helps homeless veteran. No cameras, just kindness. Within hours, the post spread like wildfire. By noon, hashtags like Keanu Kindness and James Walker Hero were trending on every major platform. Comment sections flooded with words like unbelievable, inspiring, and true hero. News outlets latched on. Reporters swarmed the transitional center gates and staked out the Community Arts Center. They wanted interviews, photographs, exclusive scoops. But Keanu wouldn't speak. This isn't about me, he told Thomas as they stood inside the Art Center lobby, watching the press gather outside. It's James. And James, for his part, wasn't sure anyone wanted to hear it. At least, not at first. A letter arrived at Hope's Haven, the veteran housing complex, the next day. Then another. By the end of the week, staff were sorting through crates of mail. Hundreds of letters came in, most addressed to James personally. Veterans from across the country wrote to thank him for his service. Mothers sent photos of their children wearing "Thank You Veterans" t-shirts. One letter simply read, "You remind me of my dad. He didn't make it home. Thank you for making it." Donations poured in alongside the letters, checks, gift cards, even handmade quilts with James's name embroidered alongside the American flag. At first, James was overwhelmed. But it didn't stop there. Veteran organizations began calling Hope's Haven, offering to help. They sent volunteers to renovate old housing units. They started job training programs on site. More than a dozen veterans, once homeless themselves, moved in within weeks, each finding a fresh start because of the attention James had brought. Keanu stayed in the background, quiet but ever present. He worked with administrators to ensure every dollar donated went directly to veterans programs. He even called his mother to share the story, how one man's quiet courage sparked something greater. She would have liked James, Keanu said softly after the call. She always said, kindness doesn't need an audience. A month later, Hope's Haven organized a small event to thank the community for their support. A few tables, under an awning, simple refreshments. No fanfare. Camden Walsh, the local news anchor from Channel 8 News, who had previously covered Keanu's diner story in Maple Creek, showed up with a camera crew. But this time he asked permission first. James wasn't a public speaker. His hands shook when they gave him the microphone. His voice was rough from years spent in cold winds, but his story came through clear and steady. "I was a staff sergeant," James said to the small crowd. "I served my country. When I came home, I lost more than I thought I could survive losing, but I never stopped trying to stand on my own." He paused, glancing toward Keanu, who stood in the back with Thomas. "And then someone saw me," James continued. "Not a celebrity, not a millionaire, just a man who listened." The audience was silent, hanging on every word. "I asked for $1, James said, his voice thick with emotion. "What I got was my dignity back." When he finished, Camden approached, with tears in his eyes. His segment aired later that night. He called it, "Keanu Reeves, A Quiet Guardian." The story went viral. Millions watched James's speech online. Schools used it in lessons about courage and kindness. Churches and community centers held viewings. But it wasn't the attention that mattered most. It was the action that followed. In the months after James's speech, initiatives for homeless veterans sprang up nationwide. A nonprofit called Dollars for Dignity launched, inspired by James's simple request and the powerful response that followed. They raised millions in their first fundraising cycle. Community art centers like Keanu's opened in 2 more cities, funded by anonymous donors, though everyone quietly credited Keanu. And James? He became a regular speaker at veterans' events. His words were simple, but his sincerity moved audiences in ways no polished speech ever could. "I was cold," James often said. "Now I'm warm. And I'm here to help make sure no other vet feels forgotten." He still worked at the Brooklyn Arts Center, tending to the garden and fixing what needed fixing. He planted a tree by the playground, marking his 1-year anniversary on the job. A brass plaque at its base read, "For James Walker, who asked for $1 and gave us hope." One sunny afternoon, James sat on a bench under the tree he planted. Keanu joined him, both men sipping iced tea. Kids ran by, laughing. Paint-smeared artists worked nearby, deep in concentration. "You know," James said after a while, "I still can't believe you stopped." Keanu chuckled. "Neither can my security team." Thomas, sitting a few feet away, lifted his drink in salute. "Worth it?" James stared out at the kids on the playground. "This is better than I ever dreamed." "You made it happen," Keanu reminded him. James shook his head. "No, you did." They sat in companionable silence, watching the sunset paint the sky with streaks of orange and gold. Later that evening, Camden Walsh aired a follow-up segment, footage of James at work in the garden, clips of kids painting murals on the center walls, Keanu teaching a small group how to play guitar. In his closing monologue, Camden said, "Sometimes a single act of compassion becomes the spark for something greater." James Walker's story reminds us, no one is invisible. And heroes come in all forms, whether they wear dog tags, wield paintbrushes, or carry the quiet strength to change a life with one simple question, "What's your name?" As the screen faded to black, James's words echoed in voiceover. "I asked for $1. What I got was a new life." And with that, a simple act of kindness continued to ripple outward, touching lives far beyond the cold streets of New York City. The crisp breeze that swept through Brooklyn that morning smelled like possibility. James Walker stood on the rooftop garden of the Community Arts Center, carefully trimming a row of sunflowers that reached for the pale autumn sun. He ran his fingers over the vibrant petals, surprised by how something so delicate could thrive in the middle of a concrete jungle. He straightened up slowly, stretching the ache out of his back, and let his gaze drift over the park across the street. A year ago, he'd slept on one of those benches, head bowed, invisible to passersby. Now, he lived a few blocks away in a small apartment, his name freshly printed on a mailbox for the first time in years. Keanu Reeves had changed his life, but it was James who had done the work to keep it moving forward. Every morning, James arrived at the Community Arts Center before sunrise. He swept the walkways, watered the plants, and unlocked the doors for the early bird artists who came to paint before the crowds arrived. His work gave him peace, but more importantly, it gave him purpose. The garden became his sanctuary. He planted flowers that reminded him of Sarah. Her favorites were daisies and herbs like the ones they used to grow in clay pots on their apartment balcony. He even convinced Keanu to help build a small vegetable patch, which they now used to supply fresh produce to the center's cafe. But James didn't stop with the plants. He started mentoring young veterans who wandered into the center, drawn by the murals, the smell of paint, or the soft hum of guitars in the workshop space. "You served?" James would ask them gently. Most nodded, sometimes stiffly, reluctant to say more. He understood, so he listened. And when they were ready, he told them his story, not as a tragedy, but as proof that you could fall hard and still find your way back up. "It took one moment," James often said, "one person who saw me." Some of the veterans took jobs at the center. Others joined group therapy sessions in the evenings. James showed them how to tend the gardens, teaching them patience as they worked the soil with weathered hands. They laughed at his old military jokes and learned the peace he had found in watching something grow. Keanu visited when he could, usually unannounced. He liked to sit quietly on one of the benches James had refurbished, sipping tea and observing the transformation of both garden and man. "You've done something special here," Keanu told James one afternoon. James smiled, wiping dirt from his hands. "We both did." James's apartment was small but warm, tucked in an old brownstone close to Prospect Park. It had 2 windows, a sturdy lock on the door, and a view of the trees. Inside, he kept things simple. A battered recliner, a bookshelf packed with old paperbacks, and a kitchen table he'd sanded down and repainted himself. But his most treasured space was a corner of the living room, where he'd created a small memorial. There, framed side by side, were photographs of his wife, Sarah, and his son, Michael. A candle burned beneath them, next to a wooden box that held his old military medals. He lit the candle every night, whispering a few words of gratitude and promise before turning in. "I made it," he often said to their photos. "I made it, and am helping others do the same." It was the life Sarah had believed he was capable of. It was the legacy Michael would have been proud of. Months after James moved into his apartment, he approached Keanu with an idea. "I want to plant a tree," he said, "in the park, for the ones who didn't come home." Keanu nodded without hesitation. "I'll help." They contacted the Parks Department, secured a permit, and organized a small ceremony. No cameras, no press, just a gathering of veterans, their families, and members of the Arts Center. On a cool afternoon in May, James stood in the center of a small crowd. He wore his old staff sergeant jacket, freshly cleaned but still bearing the wear of years. Keanu stood beside him, dressed simply in jeans and a black jacket, holding the young sapling between them. As they lowered the roots into the earth, James felt a lump in his throat. "For Sarah," he murmured, "for Michael, and for all of them." Keanu met his gaze. For all of them. They filled the hole with rich soil, patting it down with calloused hands. When they finished, James placed a small bronze plaque at the base of the tree. In honor of those who gave everything. The group stood in silence for several minutes, the wind carrying their quiet prayers through the park. Later, as they shared coffee from thermoses and told stories under the new tree's budding leaves, James realized he wasn't alone anymore. He hadn't been for some time. Camden Walsh, the Channel 8 news reporter who had covered James's transformation months before, reached out for a follow-up interview. At first, James was hesitant. He wasn't interested in fame or attention. But Camden assured him it wasn't about celebrity, it was about hope. "So," James agreed. Camden's piece aired a week later, titled, "From $1 to Dignity, the Story of James Walker." The segment opened with old footage of James's first day at the center, watering the garden with shaking hands. It followed his journey through rebuilding his life, helping other veterans, and planting the memorial tree. Keanu gave a short interview. "James didn't just get back on his feet," he said. "He built something better than what he lost. And now, he's lifting others up with him. The feature touched hearts nationwide. Donations poured into Hope's Haven and the Community Arts Center. Messages arrived from veterans and civilians alike, thanking James for sharing his story. Somewhere along the way, James's life had become a beacon for others. Despite the attention, James remained the same. He rose early, worked the gardens, mentored young veterans, and spent quiet evenings in his apartment with a paperback and a cup of tea. Keanu visited often, though always without fanfare. Sometimes they sat under the memorial tree, watching kids play on the nearby playground. Other times they walked through the arts center, watching new murals take shape. One evening, Keanu arrived with a small box. "Thought you might like this," he said. Inside was a leather-bound journal with James's initials embossed on the cover. The first page had a simple message in Keanu's handwriting. "Your story matters." James was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded. "I'll write it down." He did. Each night he wrote in the journal memories of Sarah and Michael, lessons learned on the streets, moments of grace he'd experienced in the last year. And every day his handwriting grew steadier, his words clearer. Months turned into a year. The Art Center thrived, with more veterans joining every month. The memorial tree grew taller, its leaves bright and full. James's story continued to inspire. Other communities built their own veteran gardens. Nonprofits sprang up, citing James and Keanu's example as their inspiration. Thomas, Keanu's longtime security guard, started volunteering at shelters on his days off. And James? He kept living, not just surviving, living. On the first anniversary of the memorial tree planting, James stood beside Keanu under its shade. Around them, families laughed, veterans shared stories, and children painted colorful banners that hung between the branches. "You gave me back my life," James said quietly. Keanu shook his head. "You asked for $1, you earned everything else." James smiled, his eyes full of gratitude. "Thank you, anyway." Keanu smiled back. "Anytime." And they stood there together, two men who understood the power of a single act of kindness and how it could change everything. The sun filtered softly through the windows of the newly refurbished conference room at Walker's Hope Foundation headquarters. Just a year ago, James Walker had stood outside a cafe with nothing but the courage to ask for a single dollar. Now, his name adorned the glass doors of a building that had already changed dozens of lives. Keanu Reeves stood quietly at the back of the room, arms folded, a faint smile on his face as James approached the podium. Dressed in a clean blazer and his signature staff sergeant pin gleaming on the lapel, James was no longer the tired, broken man he had once been. His shoulders were square, his eyes clear and steady. The room was packed, veterans, families, volunteers, and supporters. Among them was Talia Reynolds, owner of the Maple Creek Diner, a woman known in her town not only for her homemade pies, but for the second chances she offered people who others had given up on. Talia had been through her own transformation. Once an employee of a small-town diner that refused service to people based on their beliefs, she had taken over the restaurant after its former owner made amends. Under Talia's leadership, the Maple Creek Diner had become a place where no one was turned away. Veterans, single parents, and people down on their luck found warm meals and community inside its walls. After hearing James's story, Talia made a quiet decision. Each month, she donated a portion of her profits to Walker's Hope Foundation. She also hosted monthly veterans breakfasts, offering free meals to service members and raising funds to support transitional housing projects through the foundation. Now, seated near the front row, she smiled warmly at James. When he finished his speech, Talia stood and offered him a simple nod, a gesture of deep respect from one survivor to another. As James left the podium, he stopped beside her. "Thank you," he said softly. Talia shook her head. "No, thank you for reminding us all why we're here." Among the volunteers moving through the crowd was a young man with a rough edge to his movements, but a gentleness behind his eyes. Jesse, once known as the youngest and most conflicted member of the Iron Serpent's biker gang, had changed his life's course after witnessing Keanu's strength and mercy firsthand. Jesse had left the gang long ago, inspired by a single moment when he realized he was on the wrong path. Now he spent his days volunteering at the foundation, helping other young men, especially veterans who had fallen through society's cracks, find their footing again. Today, Jesse was guiding a group of veterans through the foundation's Job Placement Center, connecting them with employers who respected their service and their struggles. One of the men, a Marine named Darren, shook Jesse's hand. "You really think I can do this?" Darren asked. Jesse smiled. "I know you can. I've been there." Later that evening, Jesse found Keanu in the foundation's garden. "You know," Jesse began, "I never thought I'd end up in a place like this." Keanu gave him a small smile. "Neither did I. But sometimes the wrong road brings you to the right place." Jesse nodded, glancing back toward the building where James was mentoring a group of young veterans. "I'm glad I took the turn." When Keanu first proposed the idea of starting a foundation in James's name, James had hesitated. "I'm just one man," he'd said. "Exactly," Keanu replied. "And you're living proof that one person can change everything." Walker's Hope Foundation began quietly but quickly grew into a powerful force. The mission was simple yet profound: help homeless veterans transition into stable lives with dignity and support. But it wasn't just about housing or jobs. It was about restoring faith in themselves and their futures. The foundation offered mental health counseling, job training, medical care, and community building programs. There was even an arts initiative, an idea inspired by Keanu, where veterans could explore painting, music, and writing as forms of healing. 6 months after the foundation's launch, James received an invitation from the National Veterans Association. They wanted to honor him with a medal for his resilience, his advocacy, and his unwavering commitment to his fellow service members. At the award ceremony, James stood quietly on the stage as the medal was placed around his neck. He looked out at the audience, his eyes resting briefly on Keanu, then on Talia and Jesse. He cleared his throat, voice steady but thick with emotion. "I never thought I'd be standing here," James began. "There was a time when I thought my story was over. But one man refused to let me disappear. He reminded me that every life is worth fighting for, even when we've given up on ourselves." The crowd rose in a standing ovation. Keanu clapped quietly, his pride evident, but his focus still on James. After the ceremony, James found Keanu in a quiet corner. "This is because of you," James said. Keanu shook his head. "It's because of who you are." The legacy of Walker's Hope Foundation grew beyond anything James or Keanu had imagined. Stories spread of veterans finding housing, starting businesses, reconnecting with families. Communities around the country replicated the model, building safe spaces where veterans were not just honored, but uplifted. Talia expanded her diner's charity nights into a national fundraiser campaign. Every dollar raised went to support Walker's Hope projects in underserved areas. Her story of redemption, compassion, and second chances became a shining example of what could happen when people chose empathy over judgment. Jesse continued working as a mentor and volunteer, eventually opening his own workshop, where he taught veterans motorcycle repair and mechanics, a nod to his past, repurposed for good. At every event, in every garden planted, in every home rebuilt, Keanu remained present, sometimes physically, sometimes through quiet donations, but always watching, always encouraging, and always believing in the people he'd chosen to stand beside. One afternoon, Keanu and James walked together along the edge of the park where James had once slept. Children played nearby. The tree they had planted months before stood tall, its leaves rustling in the breeze. James glanced at it, then at Keanu. "I still think about that day," James said. Keanu nodded. "I do too." James chuckled. "It started with $1. Keanu smiled. "It started with courage." They stood in silence for a moment before Keanu turned to leave. "You ready for tomorrow's fundraiser?" he asked. James grinned. "Always." As Keanu walked away, James stayed behind a moment longer, watching the sunlight filter through the branches. A small plaque beneath the tree read, "In honor of those who chose to hope," and James knew without a doubt that their work was far from over. 1 year later, the park was alive with laughter and warmth, the kind that could only come from a community that had fought through darkness and found the light on the other side. It was a sunny afternoon in early spring. The air smelled of grilled burgers and fresh-cut grass. Children chased each other near the playground, their sneakers kicking up little puffs of dust, while parents and volunteers set up long tables draped in white and red checkered cloth. James Walker stood by the new pavilion, wearing a pressed navy moon shirt with the Walker's Hope Foundation logo embroidered over his heart. His weathered hands, once cracked from years on the streets, now carried a strength and steadiness that came from renewed purpose. He watched as Keanu Reeves flipped burgers at the large grill, his hair tucked under a baseball cap, an apron tied around his waist. Despite the celebrity, Keanu blended in like he was just another neighbor helping out. And today, that's exactly who he was. "Hey, James," Keanu called over his shoulder. "You sure you want me doing this? I burn toast." James chuckled, shaking his head. "If you can handle a fight scene with 3 guys at once, I figure you can manage a spatula." Keanu smiled at that, turning another burger perfectly. He glanced at James, and their eyes met. There was no need for words in that moment, just mutual respect and the quiet pride of 2 men who had found something they hadn't even realized they were missing. The community BBQ was James's idea. He wanted a way to bring together the veterans and families that Walker's Hope Foundation had helped over the past year. There were many: young vets who now had jobs and homes, single parents who had found support and community, kids who laughed again under the open sky instead of worrying about where they'd sleep at night. Beneath a nearby tree, the same tree James had planted with Keanu months earlier, a group of children played with balloons and ran in circles. Its branches stretched wide and strong now, leaves bright green against the sky. A small wooden plaque at its base read, "In honor of second chances." Talia Reynolds was there too, setting out pies on a dessert table. She laughed as a little boy snuck a fingerful of whipped cream when he thought no one was looking. Jesse, sleeves rolled up, helped set up a makeshift stage where a local band was tuning their guitars for the evening's music. Together they represented the heart of the foundation, people who had walked hard roads and come out stronger, now offering a hand to those still finding their way. As the day wore on and the sun dipped lower in the sky, James stepped up onto the stage. The crowd quieted, turning to listen. James cleared his throat, looking out over the faces. Friends, neighbors, strangers who had become family. "This past year," James began, his voice deep but steady, "has taught me something I thought I'd forgotten. That no matter how far we fall, there's always someone willing to help us stand back up." He paused, scanning the crowd until his gaze settled on Keanu, who stood near the grill with his arms crossed, listening quietly. "There's a man here today who saw me when no one else did," James continued. "I didn't ask him for much, just $1, but what he gave me was everything." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. James motioned for Keanu to join him on stage. Keanu looked uncomfortable for a moment, as he often did with public praise, but he set down his tongs and made his way up the steps. James reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. He opened it, revealing a simple, handcrafted medal made of silver and leather. The words engraved on it read, "For seeing me." "This," James said softly, holding it out, "is from all of us, for reminding us we matter." Keanu accepted the medal with quiet reverence. He studied the engraving, his fingers tracing the letters slowly. When he finally looked up, there was a wet shine in his eyes that he didn't bother to hide. "You did the hard work," Keanu replied, his voice thick but steady. "I just showed up." James shook his head. "Showing up is the hard part." The 2 men hugged briefly, their bond clear to everyone watching. As dusk settled in, lanterns strung between trees glowed softly, casting warm light over the gathering. Families sat on picnic blankets, laughing and eating. Veterans swapped stories around fire pits, their faces animated in ways they hadn't been in years. James sat on a bench near the playground, watching as children swung high into the air, their laughter ringing out. He thought about his son, Michael, who would have been around their age now. A bittersweet smile tugged at his lips. Talia came to sit beside him, offering him a cup of lemonade. "You've built something beautiful here," she said. James shook his head. "We all did." Nearby, Jesse helped a young veteran adjust the straps on a new backpack filled with supplies. Keanu walked through the crowd, chatting quietly with attendees, offering handshakes and clapping shoulders. There were no cameras, no red carpets, just a man at peace with what he had helped create. Above the entrance to the event, a banner flapped gently in the breeze. It read, "Welcome to Walker's Hope, a place for new beginnings." Later that night, after most of the guests had left and the embers of the fire pits glowed faintly, James and Keanu sat together on folding chairs, watching the stars emerge. Keanu still wore the medal James had given him, its leather cord resting against his chest. "You sure you're ready for the next step?" Keanu asked. James nodded. "I'm ready." The next phase for Walker's Hope was expanding to other cities. Talia had already offered to help train new teams. Jesse planned to open a satellite branch in his hometown. James would visit them all, mentoring new staff and making sure the heart of the mission, dignity and hope, stayed true. As they sat in comfortable silence, Keanu reached into his pocket and pulled out a coin. He flipped it to James. "For luck," Keanu said. James caught it easily. On one side was an engraving of the tree they had planted. On the other, the words, "A small act." James chuckled. "One small act." Keanu nodded. "That's all it takes." And as the moon rose over Walker's Hope, both men knew they had found something more valuable than wealth or fame. They had found purpose. As the crowd drifted away from the Walker's Hope Foundation BBQ, James Walker sat quietly under the tree he had planted, a tree that now stood as a living symbol of second chances. He watched children run and play beneath its broad branches, their laughter filling the air like music. Nearby, Keanu Reeves helped fold chairs and pack up leftover food, his presence as calm and grounded as ever. James glanced down at the handcrafted medal he had given Keanu earlier that evening. The words engraved on it, "For seeing me," reflected more than just his own gratitude. They captured the essence of everything that had happened over the last year. A story that had started with one small act, a single request for $1, and a man who chose not to ignore it. James was once invisible to the world, another homeless figure on a street corner. But Keanu Reeves saw him, not as a problem to be solved or a charity case to be pitied, but as a man deserving of dignity and respect. That choice, to see someone for who they truly are, rather than where they've ended up, is what changed everything. And that is the true lesson of this incredible story. Compassion isn't just about giving money or even time. It's about recognizing the humanity in another person. It's about making the decision to act, not because you have to, but because you can. Keanu didn't step in because he was a celebrity. He stepped in because he was human. What started with a simple question, "Can you spare $1?" became a turning point in 2 lives. James found hope, dignity, and a new purpose. And Keanu discovered once again the power of connection and empathy. But the impact didn't end with them. The Walker's Hope Foundation was born, now helping countless veterans who were once in James's shoes. People like Talia Reynolds, who runs a community kitchen at her diner, donate to keep the foundation going. Jesse, who turned his life around after years in a biker gang, now volunteers every week to help other veterans find housing and jobs. These weren't just names on a list, they were real people, each touched by one moment of compassion that had grown into something far bigger than anyone could have imagined. Keanu didn't change James's life because he was rich or famous. He changed James's life because he chose to stop, to listen, and to act. And the truth is, we all have that same power. You don't need to be a movie star to make a difference. Sometimes it's a smile, a meal, a conversation that lets someone know they're not alone. Every act of kindness creates a ripple effect. You may never know how far it spreads, but rest assured, it does. At the BBQ, when James stood up to speak, he told the crowd, "I didn't think I deserved another chance, but someone else did, and because of that, I'm here. And because I'm here, others are finding their way back too." His voice was steady, his eyes clear. He was no longer the man who stood on a corner asking for $1. He was a leader, a mentor, and a symbol of hope. And that's the legacy Keanu helped create. Not by giving money, but by giving a man back his future. The moral of this story is simple. Every single one of us has the ability to change someone's story. It doesn't have to be grand or public. It just has to be real. Compassion isn't complicated. It's in the choice to care. It's in the willingness to act. And when we act, when we offer hope, we create something far more powerful than charity. We create change. If you believe kindness changes lives, like, subscribe, and share this incredible story with others. Because stories like James's and Keanu's choice to act are reminders that hope isn't lost. It's out there, waiting for someone like you to help it grow. Join us for more inspiring tales where hope finds a way. Your support helps us share these messages and shine a light on stories that matter. Even the smallest act of compassion can spark hope where it's needed most. You never know when your simple gesture, a kind word, a helping hand, a moment of grace, will be the moment that saves someone's life.